over the course of the lecture. If at any time there's a problem with the sound, either you can't hear, or I'm talking too quickly, or you can't understand my accent, please don't hesitate to alert me, and I will correct. It's very important that everyone be able to hear and understand what I'm saying. So let's begin with a simple question. What comes to mind when you think or see or hear the word hieroglyphs? Don't be shy. Picture writing. Priestly writing. Tombs. Pharaohs. Something on a wall. Visual communication, that's very advanced. That's good. Not everyone knows that. Good. Anything else? Sorry? Napoleon. We'll get to him for sure. Great. Well, yes. Interestingly, what I thought you guys would say, but you didn't, was exoticism or mysticism or esotericism. Because if you've been on the internet ever and ever searched Egypt, you'll know that's one of the first things that, thank you, that comes up. This perception of Egypt and its language is something mysterious, of secrets that are hidden. But it seems that you guys already know that there's nothing mysterious about hieroglyphs. It just happens to be the system that the Egyptians used to write their language. The language we call Egyptian, which was the ancient and original language of Egypt. Now, in ancient Egyptian, the Egyptians themselves referred to the script as meduneter, meaning script or written characters. Its original etymology means words of the gods. Literally, it means words of the god or words of the gods. Probably a reference to the fact that the Egyptians believed that writing came to them from the Egyptian god Thoth. I assume we all know who Thoth is, right? We've seen him before, maybe? The ibis-headed god. So that was their belief. We're going to talk more tomorrow about where writing actually came from. But today we're going to talk about hieroglyphs and their discovery and how we came to know exactly what they stand for. Before we go too far, let's make sure we're all on the same page about a few things. First of all, what do we mean by ancient Egypt? The exact borders are debatable, but when we talk about ancient Egypt, we're really talking about the Nile River Valley, right? From somewhere around Aswan, the modern city of Aswan, all the way to the Mediterranean. In different periods of history, if you know anything about Egyptian history, of course the borders expanded south and into Western Asia and so forth, but this is a good starting point. Egypt is, of course, a land of contrast. You have the fertile Nile Valley here in the middle, full of wildlife and plants and food and all kinds of great things, but it's surrounded by deserts to the east, to the west, and to the south. But in these deserts are a wealth of resources, stone, minerals, things that helped make Egypt such a wealthy, successful society. And the dry climate also of Egypt on its fringes meant that thousands upon thousands of artifacts have survived until this day. That plus the fact that Egyptian society was a very visual society. They're very interested in visual material. The result of this is that we have large amounts of written material spanning thousands of years. How many thousands of years? Well, let's look at the when. Don't be alarmed by all the text. I just want to give you a sense of the time scale that we're talking about. So the beginning and the ending dates of Egyptian civilization are also open to some debate, but basically the earliest inhabitants in the Nile Valley, they came from different areas in different surrounding regions, but a lot of them came from the west, from what is now the Sahara. Way back, before 6,000 BC, from roughly 8,000, 7,000, this region of North Africa, the climate was very different. It was a lot more rainy and wet. You had hunter-gatherers, you had pastoralists, very different from today. From around 6000 BC, it starts drying up. And it's thought that that is the kind of motivating factor for why we have an intensification of settlements in the Nile Valley, which we really see start to happen around 4000 BC. But the key date, though, that I want you to focus on is the 3300 date. That's when we have the earliest hieroglyphs, the earliest evidence of hieroglyphs. And then the other key date to look at is AD 394. It's very specific, yes. That's when we have the last known hieroglyphic inscription. Let's take a look. So, on the left are tags. They're made out of ivory or bone, and they were used to label pots. We're going to talk about them more tomorrow, so that's all I'm going to say about them today. But these are the earliest surviving example of something resembling hieroglyphs that we have. On the right is the latest known inscription from hieroglyphic inscription from Egypt. It's written by a scribe, and it accompanies an illustration of a Nubian god named Mandulis. And the inscription basically says, I did this drawing of Mandulis, so it might last forever. And it gives his name and his titles and the date. Now, the hieroglyphs are a bit crude at this point compared to some of the more elegantly carved examples we'll see at some other time. But hieroglyphic had been falling out of use for quite a while by this point. The Egyptian language at this point was predominantly being written by other scripts. But that doesn't mean this is the end of the Egyptian language, not even close. Okay, sorry, the way this is set up, I know it's pretty inconvenient. You guys can't see because this is in the way. Sorry. Sorry about that. But what we have here is a timeline of scripts that are used in ancient Egypt. And what I want you to grasp from this, and we'll be looking at this slide again in the next two lectures, is the longevity of the language in its written form. So what do we have here? We have hieroglyphic, which you've obviously all heard of. Many of you have probably also heard of hieratic. Hieratic was a cursive version of hieroglyph that was used on more perishable materials, like papyrus. But it also could be used on other materials, like pottery. Demotic is an even more abbreviated form of hieroglyphs. It's kind of a shorthand for hieroglyphs. It develops out of hieratic. And it's also, there's a dialect of the same name. Again, we'll be going over all these things in more detail on Friday when we do dialects and stages, but you need to know these terms now to understand how hieroglyphic is deciphered. But it's important to understand that these hieratic and demotic are derivations of the hieroglyphic script, and they write the Egyptian language also. Hieroglyphic is used mostly for monumental purposes, on monuments, official documents, really stuff that's set up in public. Hieratic and demotic are used for everyday text, but also literature. And then demotic gets used also for on monuments as well. But it's a later stage of the language. If you look at the dates, right, 3300 all the way almost until today, that's a very long time. Languages change, and Egyptian is no different. So the demotic dialect is quite a bit different from the earlier ones, and we'll look at that kind of later. Coptic. Now, how many of you have heard of Coptic? Oh, great. Okay. I could have assumed more knowledge. Okay, great. So you already know, you've heard of Coptic. It's really important for this story. If you need a reminder, Coptic is another script for writing Egyptian. It's basically, especially in its early stage, it writes the same Egyptian as Demotic, right? It's just two different scripts writing the same language. But it's in Greek. The script is Greek. They borrow Greek letters. They add some letters from Demotic to make up for sounds that don't exist in Greek, and you get the Coptic script. And the Coptic script lasts for quite a long time. as well as the Coptic language. So the spoken language, the Coptic dialect, is spoken until maybe the 11th century AD or thereabouts, so we think. At that point, it's completely overtaken by Arabic. Right? Arabic comes into use starting in the 7th century AD and gradually replaces the Coptic, the Egyptian language. But Coptic continues as a written language, is part of the Coptic Church, right? Well until the 18th century, and even today, Coptic is still used. How many of you have been to Egypt? I should have asked this at the beginning. Oh, see, yeah. So how many of you have been to the Coptic section of Cairo? Right, great. So as you know, Coptic is still used even today. But this survival of written Coptic is key. I know you've all heard of the Rosetta Stone, and we'll get there too, but I can't emphasize enough how important the survival of Coptic is to our understanding of hieroglyphs. Okay. Before we get into that, I thought we should probably talk a little bit about what do we mean by writing. And just, again, so we kind of have a working definition of it, the way I put it up there is that writing is a specific form of visual communication that represents speech. And therefore is distinguished from certain forms of visual communication that don't represent speech, and which are often referred to as semasiographic. I won't make you say this word. You can also say non-glottographic, or you can just say pictures. But we are all familiar with this type of writing, right? It's enjoying a renaissance, a resurgence in the 21st century, thanks to globalization, thanks to emojis, thanks to digital technology, which is a whole different topic, right, for another course. On the other hand, then you have what's called glottographic. That is visual marks that actually represent spoken language. And all of these languages, all these scripts rather, pictured here are glottographic, including hieroglyphic. Hieroglyphic is true writing, and I feel like maybe I don't have to for this crowd to emphasize this, but for some you do have to emphasize it because there are people who believe the hieroglyphic is still just picture writing, but it's not. It represents sounds. More often than not, the individual symbols are phonographic. Did I put that? Yes, they're phonographic. Now, you do have signs that are ideographic, that is, they represent an idea or a concept rather than a sound. We have those signs, but most signs are used phonographically. And we'll go over that more with examples tomorrow. But the thing is, from the time of the last inscription in the 4th century AD until the 19th century, when it was deciphered, again, most intellectuals believe the opposite of this. For them, hieroglyphs corresponded to objects and conceptions of the mind. Hieroglyphs communicated information immediately, without language, without the need for speech. And this misunderstanding that hieroglyphs weren't phonetic was the biggest stumbling block to the decipherment. It's the one thing that kind of really held it up the longest. So where did this misunderstanding come from? Well, the Greeks, actually. So, sorry for anyone who is especially partial to the Greeks, but since antiquity, Egypt was regarded as a place of old revered knowledge, a place of wisdom, a place of esoteric knowledge, and very exotic. And it became a popular tourist destination, much as it is today. Lots of Greeks and later Romans came to visit, especially those who are interested in religion and philosophy and knowledge in general. And hieroglyphs attracted a lot of attention. And Greek and Roman writers wrote about them, even though they didn't really understand them. And by the time the Greeks were visiting Egypt, hieroglyphs proper were really restricted to monuments. So we're talking, around the 5th century BC and later. And even very few of the priests knew them. It was a very small group of people who had complete knowledge of the system. And so when the Greek visitors were investigating, they came to the conclusion that in Egypt there was 2 scripts. There was the sacred script, which they called hieratic, and hieroglyphs. Sometimes they confuse the two, sometimes they distinguish them. And coming from the word sacred, hence our word hieroglyph. But then also there was the more common or popular script. They referred to it as demode, right, which comes from demos, which means people, right? So that's where the word demotic comes from. It's been applied in modern terms to go to this, sorry, is this working? Okay. To refer to this script. So, and they believed that then the demotic script was for everyday things, and that hieroglyphics was purely for sacred and very restricted knowledge. And they also thought it was just picture writing. They thought it was just symbols. They didn't think it had anything to do with an alphabet, whereas they did think the demotic script was an alphabet, even though that's not true. But for them, Egyptian hieroglyphs were just picture writing, encoded within them the mysteries of Egyptian knowledge. And a key work that had a great impact on later Renaissance thinkers was the Hieroglyphica by a man named Horapollo. Horapollo was an Egyptian priest from the 5th century AD, so during the time of the Byzantine Empire, very late in Egypt's history. He was one of the few remaining priests of the pre-Christian cults in Egypt. And he wrote a manual of hieroglyphs, maybe in the 5th century AD. It was discovered in the 15th century AD, but modified a bit, but scholars think that maybe the first book, at least, is authentic to the 5th century AD. And in this, he gives explanations for a whole list of hieroglyphs. And it seems that while he knew their meanings, his understanding of why they meant what they did was fundamentally flawed. So I've given you some examples on the screen. So for example, the verb to open. It's used, it's written using the hieroglyph for the hair. And his explanation is the reason for this is because the hair always has its eyes open. The serpent, right? So the word for eternity is also spelled with the serpent. And he said this is because one particular species of serpents is immortal, and also serpents can instantly kill people by just breathing on them. It's power of life and death. Another example is the word for mother. And he said this is spelled with the vulture because there are only women vultures, or only female vultures in nature. There are no male vultures in nature. So these are the kind of explanations he came up with. And this was really influential at the time, in the 15th century. This made a lot of sense because what people were looking for in hieroglyphs was a language that would describe, that was very attached to nature, right? That was attached to the natural world, that transcends verbal language. So people were into it. But it's, of course, very wrong. It has nothing, the word for open is written with a rabbit, a hare, not because of any connection to rabbits, but because they're homonyms, right? So the word for hare at the time when this writing system was being conceived had a biconsonantal root. It had two consonants in its root, what we would call W and N. Coincidentally, so does the word open. It also has the same consonantal root. Therefore, you can use the same symbol to be part of the spelling of that word. And so you can see what I've done here is to give you a whole bunch of examples of different words that use that same hieroglyph as part of its spelling, in order to demonstrate, again, in case it wasn't clear, why this trying to connect the hieroglyph with this esoteric definition is not correct. You can see the differences for this root when. You can use it to spell indeed, exist, hourly staff, open, all kinds of things. Now, if this seems weird or odd, don't worry, we're going to get into spelling tomorrow. And just keep in mind, without getting too ahead of ourselves, Egyptian didn't write down the vowels, which has major ramifications for then how it's spelled, of course. But we'll get to those details again tomorrow. So, right. So Horapollo was, as I said, influential. the idea persisted that the hieroglyphs are symbols, they communicate some sort of ideal knowledge about the world. Egypt remained exotic, they had special knowledge. Hieroglyph was a codification of a secret language and secret knowledge. And it was difficult for intellectuals from the late antiquity all the way until the Renaissance to conceive of hieroglyphic as a type of writing that would be used to write something mundane, like official correspondence or procurement lists, right? Accounting. They couldn't accept this. This is not even in the realm of their consideration. So in the Renaissance, decipherment meant explaining the meaning, the mystical significance of hieroglyphs, rather than trying to read them. It's rather just to kind of interpret them, not assume that they are, that there are sentences to be extracted. So not surprisingly, they didn't make much headway. So how did it change? Well, a couple of things that led scholars to start challenging the conventional wisdom. First of all, we start to get a European awareness of certain other languages, like Aztec and Chinese. And these writing systems combine ideographic symbols with phonetic symbols, just like Egyptian. So this got people to thinking. Plus, in the 18th century, and with the coming of the Enlightenment, you had the increased scientific study of language. And both of these kind of movements or circumstances encouraged scholars to rethink their assumptions about the Egyptians and about hieroglyphs. So we have some first steps in the 17th and 18th century. One notable one is Athanasius Kircher. He's a German Jesuit. He was a mathematician and a scientist, and he studied Coptic quite intensively. And he created a Coptic grammar. And he is one of the first, at least that we know of, who recognized or speculated that Coptic was a direct descendant of the ancient Egyptian language, of language that might be represented by hieroglyphs. But he still believed hieroglyphs were purely symbolic. He was deeply into philosophy and ancient philosophy. He was a bit of a Neoplatonist, very much into esotericism. So he did publish one of the earliest kind of modern, if you will, works on Egyptology, Oedipus Egyptiacus, and it was a 4-volume work on all kinds of aspects of Egypt, with drawings and paintings and explanations of religion. And he also translated the obelisks that are in Rome, right? The ones that were taken from Egypt by the Romans and are still in Rome. These translations were complete nonsense. He translated these very flowery religious and philosophical texts. They bear no resemblance at all to what these obelisks say, but they were so well written that people really liked them and totally bought into it, right? Because again, it's a reminder, it's how you say something, right? Not whether or not it's actually correct. So for a while, people were very impressed with what he had done. Later on, we have Jean-Jacques Barthélemy, who I bring him up here because he actually deciphered key languages key scripts from Western Asia. How many of you have heard of Palmyra? Great. So he deciphered Palmyrene, right? The scripts used by the citizens of Palmyra in what is today Eastern Syria. He also cracked Phoenician, in both cases because of bilingual texts, right? Greek, Palmyrene, Greek, Phoenician. And he also proposed that the cartouches of Egyptian held royal names, that these must be the kings. And this is important because we knew the name of the kings back then, sort of, right? They were recorded in the Greek authors. Now, the Greek authors don't have them quite right, but it's something, right? There's a connection, as we'll see. In ancient Egyptian at this point.
At the time that you were speaking of this,
they knew Coptic. They knew about Coptic.
And that was sufficiently similar to ancient Egyptian.
Well, we're getting there. You're getting ahead of me. They don't think so yet. There's a suspicion, but they're not quite there yet. Because, of course, at this time, I should have made sure to cover it, but just in case there's any confusion. At this time in Egypt, of course, it's Arabic, right? It's entirely Arabic. But Coptic is still, it's still around for the diligent investigator to go find. Right, so then we also had the Bishop William Warburton, and he was very interested in the origins of writing, especially from a biblical perspective, in studying the emergence of monotheism from polytheism and so on. And he proposed that alphabets actually derived from picture systems, which was novel at the time. And he also surmised that Egyptian inscriptions and temples recorded not just esoteric religious knowledge, but also historical achievements. And he perceived of Egypt as a rational society. He dismissed the idea that hieroglyphs were intended to hide knowledge. And this was, again, quite new at the time, but it's not such a leap because he read closely the Roman texts. And the Romans talked about the Egyptians like any other people in the Mediterranean. So he got some of this from the Romans. But then we have Georg Zoega. He's Danish. I'm sure I mispronounced his name, so forgive me. He agreed with Warburton. He thought the Egyptians were no different from other people and that their writing was surely rational. And thus, to judge by other scripts, it would not be purely symbolic. It would have both ideographic elements and phonetic elements too. And he started making a list of individual signs, which is the first step to decipherment. So if you're taking notes on how you decipher languages, that's usually your first step. Make a list of signs. He also recognized the value of Coptic and also recognized cartouches as containing the name of individual pharaohs. But keep in mind, these guys are all in Europe, right? And the Coptic is in Egypt. So it's not like there's a lot of transmission going on. To actually study Coptic would take a lot of effort. And it's going to happen, but it's not, besides Athanasius, it hasn't quite happened yet. So they're on the right track. They're getting there. But at this point, in the late 18th century, they're missing a few key tools. So what do you need in order to translate an undeciphered script or language? First of all, you need a large corpus of texts. Only having a few makes it very difficult. Second, you need a bilingual text, preferably several, right? Again, one will help you. More than that would be better. Knowledge of related languages. So how many of you have heard of Etruscan? Yeah, everyone has, right? So we can read the Etruscan script, right? Because it's closely related to Greek. But we don't know the Etruscan language. And why is that? Well, we know what it sounds like. We can read it thanks to the Greek. But, sorry, someone was going to say? No, we have lots of texts. Not as many as we'd like. No related language.
No Etruscans living today to listen to.
That too. Yeah, if we could just ask them, that would be very helpful. But there's no related language. There's some speculation about a few, and maybe some of you know more about that than I do. But in general, they haven't successfully found a connected language that's close enough to make sense of it. So we can transcribe the Etruscan inscriptions, but we don't really know beyond names and places. We don't know the grammar, right? We can't read what they've written. So knowledge of related languages is important. And then, of course, persistence, right? Because it's not easy, and an open mind. Maybe open mind isn't the right word. I should say a little bit of creativity, willingness to make leaps. So when does the big break come? Well, it comes with Napoleon, of course, who was mentioned earlier. So Napoleon, after his victories at the end of the 18th century in Italy, he invaded Egypt. He went on a bit of a misadventure, right, in the Eastern Mediterranean. He invaded Egypt, I believe it's 1798, right? Yeah, well, who knows? Okay, with an army of 25,000 people. And the idea was that he was going to overthrow colonial Ottoman rule, although, of course, his interests were really to block the British, from opening a sea passage through Egypt to India. There was something quite novel about Napoleon's army in that he included with it 165 scientists and scholars, cartographers, artists, engineers, biologists, naturalists, and so on. And their goal was to record and study as much as they could about Egypt, its environment, its monuments, its history, its current people. And so they traveled throughout Egypt, recording anything and everything that they could, including some hieroglyphic inscriptions. And eventually this led to a publication of the famous Description de l'Égypte. You can download it online. It's out of copyright, so you can find digital copies. And it has all kinds of really fascinating illustrations. But the expedition went a long way then to fixing number one in our criteria, started to create a body of texts, right? Accurate copies of monuments to send back to the people in Europe who were trying to break this code. And of course, though, what it's really famous for with regards to Egyptology is producing this object, what they referred to as the tablet from Rosetta at the time. And the Rosetta Stone, was discovered in 1799 in July by some engineers with the French army as they were reconstructing, or rather kind of building up a fort. And they were dismantling an old wall and to make way to build a new wall, and they found this stone in the wall. And this is very common, right? The reuse of materials, whether they're statues, old monumental building fragments, or even inscriptions. The reuse of stone is very, very common throughout the Mediterranean. If it's Egypt, Greece, the Middle East, why recut a stone when you've got perfectly good stone right here that no one cares about anymore? Such is the case with the Rosetta Stone. They recognized it immediately, though, for what it was, at least that there were different scripts on there. And they cleaned it off quickly, and they had the Greek translated very quickly. And to their delight, the Greek states straight out that the Greek is a translation of the others, that each inscription says basically the same thing. So this is very exciting for them. It was declared at the time the most valuable relic from antiquity. They sent it to Cairo, and copies of the inscription were made and sent to Paris. The artifact itself, in its preserved form, it's a little over a meter tall, about 75 centimeters wide. How many of you have actually seen it in the British Museum? A few of you. How many of you have seen the replica in Ezeko? Shame. For shame. The Slave Lodge, right? There's an exhibit of Egyptian artifacts in the Slave Lodge. In fact, it's been recently renovated. And I encourage you to go see it. It's a small collection, but it's nice. And in there is a replica of the Rosetta Stone. So you don't have to go to London to see it. And even if you went to London to see it, if you went during high season, good luck getting close to it, because this is usually what it looks like around high season. Sorry, I wish I could lift it up to show you. But crowds of people all around. For the next two lectures, I'll make sure not to put any crucial information in the lower right-hand corner of the slides. This is such a poor design. Anyways, so the French had it. How did it end up in the British Museum? Well, I'm assuming all of you are good students of history, so you probably know the answer to that. Napoleon's adventures didn't go so well, and they eventually surrendered in 1801, and as part of the deal, the French had to hand over everything they had acquired. There was some negotiating because the French didn't want to give up everything, and the English were willing to negotiate, but not about this, right? So the Rosetta Stone was sent off to England, and it was donated by King George to the British Museum. So that's how it came to be in our knowledge, but what is it? So it's a decree. It's a legal and religious decree drawn up by the priests who were the kind of, they're like the heads of the corporations of that time, right? They're not in the government, but they're very, very powerful. It's an agreement between them and the king at the time, Ptolemy V. 196 BC is when it dates to. the time of Greco-Macedonian rule over Egypt. And it's a quid pro quo. The crown agreed to give certain privileges and assets, to the temples. The temples in exchange agreed to hold all kinds of festivals in the king's honor, do nice things for his ruler cult, that kind of stuff. So it's it's a legal document, but also a religious one, because these things are not separated at this time. It's in 3 scripts. At the top, you've got the hieroglyphic script. The language is Egyptian, but the dialect is what some people might call today traditional Middle Egyptian. The best analogy I can think of is Arabic. It's like if it were written in classical Arabic of the Quran, right? In nice and beautiful, calligraphy. In the middle is the Demotic script, also Egyptian language, but the Demotic dialect, which is like the current dialect being spoken in Egypt. So, going with the same Arabic analogy, it's as if this were written in Egyptian Arabic, in just kind of a everyday Arabic script. And then you had Greek in Greek. Greek script, Greek language. The Greek, as you can see, it's hard to see here because of how I've blown it up, but the Demotic one is 32 lines long. The Greek one is a lot longer, 53 lines. And the Egyptian is unfortunately only 13 lines, because the rest is missing. This type of stele is well known from Egypt. It's a common type of genre of writing, so that's why it's reconstructed the way it is. Where's the rest of it? Well, it's never been found. They searched all over Rosetta, but Rosetta didn't actually exist in antiquity. Rosetta is a result of sediment from the Nile piling up. So where Rosetta is today was actually water. Probably it's from some other sites. It was originally erected in some other sites in the Delta, and then it was broken or something, and then stone from that site was brought to Rosetta for the building of whatever structure it was that they were investigating. So it was probably broken before it ever came to Rosetta, and that's why they haven't found the other pieces. But there's hope, right? They can still turn up. There are new discoveries every day, so maybe someday it'll show up. Okay, so this, of course, was a massive breakthrough, right? Finally, we have with a modern language, we have Egyptian hieroglyphs plus Greek, and I should say modern, but a surviving language, right? Because it's ancient Greek. So what happens? Everyone goes to it, right? All the interested parties get very excited about it. So just briefly, Johan David Alcott, he was a Swedish diplomat based at Constantinople. He focused on the Demotic parts. And you can see from his transcription, I hope, what he was able to do with the Greek is match it up to a certain extent and start dividing up words and start recognizing words. He identified the proper names. He identified words for temple and Greek and the word for and. The ones that he would be easy because they're repeated, right, throughout. So he identified these, and he published the Demotic alphabet. It wasn't quite accurate, but it was a start. Better progress comes along with a man whose name was Thomas Young. Now, Thomas Young was an extraordinary person in that he was very talented in many different areas. In fact, he's more well known for his achievements in physics. In particular, he's responsible for coming up with the wave theory of light. But he had lots of interests and was familiarity with many languages. And he made a key observation that both Egyptian scripts, the Demotic and the hieroglyphic, both contain phonetic and non-phonetic signs, and that they were related as well. He also, he continued the previous work. He focused mostly on Demotic and managed to make a translation of the Demotic. Again, not entirely accurate, but he had the general gist of it. And so he's widely considered the person who deciphered Demotic. And he published that result as well. Now, he looked at the hieroglyphs as well, and he made some headway. He was able to identify the names of Ptolemy, right, in the cartouche, and his epithets. And he was also able to isolate words like king and Egypt and son. You can see them here in a letter that he wrote. They're not all correct, but he's on his way, right? You can see here we are, eternity, with the serpent, sun is correct, king. He gets it. The nice thing about the Rosetta Stone is a good text for this purpose because these types of inscriptions are very formulaic. They're legal, right? And as we all know, legal texts are boring and repetitive. They have a lot of the same particular language over and over again. So in some ways, it's a great text to have as you're bilingual to figure things out. So he started to make some work. And he identified numbers as well, and God's names and so on. All in all, he offered translations for about 200 hieroglyphic groups based on comparison to the Greek and Demotic. But he didn't take it much further than this because he had a lot of interest. He had a lot going on, right, in other fields. It was left to Champollion, right? I'm sure we've all heard of Champollion. So he was his contemporary of Young. He was a real prodigy when it came to languages. He was keeping a diary in Coptic at the age of 16. He was extremely talented with languages, and he was also fully committed to Egyptology, unlike Young. Like, this was his passion. And that, no doubt, is why he ultimately becomes successful. That and his extensive, very close familiarity with other languages, including Coptic, but also his knowledge of Hebrew, Arabic. He studied Chinese, and so on. So on his own, following the kind of same path as Young, Champollion manages to arrive at similar conclusions. He identifies the word Ptolemy. He gets that there is a relationship between Demotic and hieroglyphs. He recognizes that there are phonetic elements of these signs. And he comes up with about a working list of 20 or so hieroglyphic signs that he thinks represent phonetic signs, phonetic entities. And he continued the work by looking for inscriptions that had other names of Greek and Roman emperors, because they're easy to match with the Greek or the Latin. And he finds these, he looks at all these copies of inscriptions from Egypt, comes up with a list of cartouches for Greek and Roman rulers, publishes it all in 1822. But he had made a greater discovery in secret, which he didn't publish at that point because he wasn't ready to reveal it. He was still, fleshing it out. He kept it to himself until he could be sure. Up until this point, Champollion had been operating under the assumption that hieroglyphs were still in general symbolic. So was Young. They recognized that some had a phonetic element, but they thought that was a late development. They thought that that was a transformation of the language in order to meet the needs of their foreign rulers, in order to put the names of foreigners in hieroglyphs. So they thought before the Greco-Roman period that you wouldn't have phonetic values, that would be symbolic. They both thought that. So, where did the breakthrough come from? Well, it didn't come from the Rosetta Stone. It came from the Temple of Karnak. So, as I mentioned, Champollion was looking for Greek and Roman king names all over the place, looking at the material from Karnak, from other places, and so forth. The great temple of Amun at Karnak and so on. And then he kept noticing, of course, some other cartouches that were not Greek or Roman kings, that they must have been the kings from before that period. And their cartouches kept appearing again and again and again with certain symbols. And he recognized these groups of symbols. So he saw them recurring again and again. So, on the one, which we know is the cartouche of Thutmose III, he kept seeing these four symbols, right? This round one, this one that looks like a three-pronged thing. I'll tell you what it is later. And this symbol, which he already knew from his other work, is S, from Ptolemaios. Sorry, I said Thutmose. This is Ramesses. I'm sorry, Ramesses. This is Thutmose over here. And same thing, here is this cartouche of Tutmosis appearing again and again and again. And he sees these same characters, including one character which he knew was the god Thoth. The Isis god Thoth, who is, of course, responsible for writing, but also a major god in the pantheon. He started making connections, looking at Greek papyri, looking at Coptic, and looking at the Greek historical texts. So how many of you have heard of Manetho? No. Oh, I finally found something. Okay, that very few of you know. So Manetho, but he's important. You should know about him, okay? So Manetho is an Egyptian priest also, writing in the 3rd century BC, and he wrote a history of Egypt for Greeks. He wrote it in Greek for Greeks, even though he was Egyptian. He's the one who's responsible for the dynasties as we know it. He's the one who divides it into Dynasty 1, Dynasty 2, Dynasty 3, Dynasty 18, etc. So if you are ever looking at those king lists and think this is so weird, why is it like this? Manetho, you can thank him. And so we don't have all of Manetho's history, unfortunately. We have summaries of it, and including the king lists. So Champollion's looking at Manetho's king list, and he's like, wow, there's a lot of guys named Ramesses in the 19th and 20th dynasties. There's also a few guys named Tutmosis, and they're quite important too. Then he looks at Coptic, and in Coptic, the word for sun is Ra, right? And then the word to give birth is Mis. And it occurs to him, basically, that Egyptian names that appear in Greek texts, which are clearly not Greek, they're not Greek at all, are very similar to words in Coptic. And then he begins to realize that Egyptian names are combinations of words, like they are in so many languages, right? And so it occurs to him, Ra-Meses, or Ra-Mes, in Coptic would be, Ra is born. That's what, and he knew that from Coptic texts. Same thing then, if you took the Tot, and Tot is the first part of Tutmosis in Greek, and it's also the name of the god, as it's reported in Greek. Tot-Mes, if you translated that into Coptic, would mean Thoth is born. He's like, well, this can't be a coincidence. Plus, if you look, then this symbol is in both names, right? So that's how he makes the connection. And then he also makes the leap that the disk might represent the sun, right? So you have Ramos, and it ends in S, so that seems to be a hint. Ramos, this seems plausible. It's a theory, right? That's how decipherment works. You test things and you try to take it further and see if it starts to make sense. It's a snowball effect, right? You know you're on the right track if things start making sense. If they don't, then you're on the wrong track. So Ramos says, fine. And then at least for the first part of this name, Tutmos, Thoth is born, and it connected. And so this was kind of his breakthrough moment from these. And then but before going on and announcing it, he used this then to further go back to the Rosetta Stone and to further his study. And of course, he was correct. His instincts were right. And so he had these realizations, and the implications were quite great. He realized that Coptic could be used to reconstruct ancient Egyptian vocabulary and grammar as a direct descendant, and that phonetic signs were used before the Greco-Roman period. Not only that, what this led him to do is he went back and kind of studied the Rosetta Stone with this new knowledge, and kind of going forward, is that he realized that certain signs have certain orthographical functions. Like some signs will typically end words. They have a certain place, a certain use. So this helped him to start dividing up the words more correctly in the hieroglyphic inscriptions. And from there, then he was able to start linking it more accurately with the Greek text. And so then he published his results in 1824, and then comes to the conclusion that which we now accept and which we now believe is correct about hieroglyphic writing, that it is a complex system. It's figurative, symbolic, and phonetic in one and the same text, in one and the same sentence, and in one and the same word. Because that's what we do have. We have ideograms and phonograms in the same word. And that is something we will get into, of course, tomorrow. So, to sum up, Champollion, in his success, the Rosetta Stone was absolutely key, right? This is what we're all taught. This is what you always read. But it wasn't just the Rosetta Stone, right? It was the survival of Coptic. It was his close familiarity with the Coptic, his linguistic talent, his familiarity with a variety of language and scripts. One thing I meant to mention, just mention quickly, but I forgot, is that, of course, what's missing is the vowels. But Champollion was okay with that too, because he was familiar with Arabic and Hebrew, and he knew there were scripts that don't write all the vowels. They sometimes write indications of vowels. That's what happens in Egyptian too. We'll talk about that tomorrow. But because he had this broad awareness of different language systems and different writing systems, it's really helped him to make the leaps and make the connections that he needed to do. So, Champollion's achievement, of course, was just the beginning. Egyptians left no systematic treatises on the grammar of their language, so it differs from some other ancient languages. This means that our understanding of the Egyptian language is entirely a modern reconstruction. So there's still a lot of disagreements and a lot of uncertainties, especially about the verbal system, and the reasons why we're so uncertain it has to do with the spelling, and I'll get into that tomorrow. But nonetheless, thanks to Champollion and those before him, from this point forward, the Egyptians could finally start speaking for themselves. Okay, so for next time, we're going to do the origins of writing and the fundamentals of the hieroglyphic systems, but at this point, of course, I am happy to take any questions. Sorry? Oh. Yes, the vocalization is a problem. We don't really know how. It's complicated, but we don't know exactly how they spoke these words. Now, we can reconstruct some of it from Coptic, but most of what you would read and you'll find in the internet or textbooks is just a modern convention for Egyptologists to be able to communicate with each other. So the transliteration is on the top, and then what Egyptologists do is just insert vowels in just so we can actually say the words. One way to say this would be Dewa Netter Ten Senebi, but it's not authentic, right? So it's one of the fun things about learning Egyptian is that you can basically pronounce it however you want to, and you're not wrong. You're not right, but no one can prove you're wrong either, right? What it literally means is praise to God for you. That's how they typically. That's a frequent way of saying thank you. Thanks to God for you. Praise to God for you. And then be healthy, right? And at the end, you can see though there's that sign with the circle and the two things. That actually means twice. Be healthy 2 times. Be healthy, be healthy. It's a way of emphasizing it. So you can already hopefully see how it's both phonetic and ideographic at the same time, which is actually an advantage, I think, for a script, as we'll see, as opposed to the purely alphabetic ones, right? Yeah.
Is the Rosetta Stone the only
bilingual?
Multilingual?
There's several now. Yeah. There's another one similar to that one, also from the Hellenistic period. But no, there's quite a few, I think, now. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the thing is there's a few answers for that. For one thing, literacy rates were very low in ancient Egypt, right? Only the elites learned how to read and write, and only the scribes and the priesthood. And but the real easy answer to that, Christianity. Once Christianity took over, a lot of Christians in Egypt saw hieroglyphs as not an okay way to write things. It was iconic. And so that's why Coptic was adopted, actually. That's why you had Coptic and Demotic used simultaneously, is that Christians in Egypt weren't comfortable with using a script that had been derived from images. So that's probably the most obvious reason. Had it continued as with the traditional religion up until today, then no doubt it would still be around. I think maybe.
Was it usually written left to right, or
Ah.
right to left, or down?
All of the above. We'll talk about that tomorrow. But all things given, they seem to have a